Support for Swan Song is brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you. If you thought Umizuri ni Iko was the only fishing game on the WonderSwan, you'd be wrong. After almost 6 years of waiting, here's another Swan Song episode about a fishing game, Fishing Freak's Bass Rise for WonderSwan, developed by Beck, published by Bandai, and released on February 24th, 2000. Fishing Freak's Bass Rise is a WonderSwan port of the 1999 PlayStation game of the same name, which surprisingly did see a North American release under the name Bass Rise. That game is kind of a beautiful mess. The menu presentation is very reminiscent of the first two Gran Turismo games, which is something I will never be able to resist, and in its loading screen it has the audacity to describe itself as custom technology, the God's dimension, 3D real water. Its sound design is also kind of stunning for such an unassuming game, with the game eschewing music altogether and going all in with environmental soundscapes that sound pretty damn impressive considering there are a dozen different locations to fish in. And then you try to actually fish and it runs like crap because they were going a bit too hard and burnt all their CPU cycles trying to make the water physics feel realistic. But hey, at least they tried to make something cool, and they were maybe a bit too ambitious for their budget. The PlayStation game also features fully licensed lures from the Megabass General Baits Company, and naturally their branding is all over the box, manual, and inside the game itself. Fishing is a leisure activity that rewards people with a lot of patience, which unfortunately isn't a resource I have a ton of, so I'm warning you ahead of time that this is definitely going to color my opinion of this game. Having gone fishing a few times with my grandparents literal decades ago, I can pretty safely say that for a lot of people, it's not the activity of fishing itself, but rather everything surrounding it that makes fishing trips fun. It's cool to pack lunches, load up the car with all your gear, and drive out to a beautiful nature spot to relax with people whose company you enjoy for the day. If you make the outcome the focus of the activity, you're signing up for disappointment, but by making the trip itself as enjoyable as possible on its own, any fish that end up being caught just become the cherry on top of an already great experience. At least, that's the way I feel as the most casual of fishermen, and even calling myself that feels like I'm stealing valor somehow. I think fishing as a sport is poorly suited to being a video game when playing it straight, because it leads to experiences like the one I had while trying to record footage for this video, when I sat there for 40 minutes straight not getting any bites at all. Not only was I incredibly bored in the moment, but I was even more worried about this potentially being the most boring episode I would ever make. As I see it, there are only two viable paths to making a good fishing game. The first is to throw out the pretense of realism and just make a fun video game centered around the mechanical actions of fishing. Two games that come to mind here are Sega Bass Fishing from 1997 and Vlambeer's 2013 mobile game Ridiculous Fishing. Both games feature gameplay loops that trim out all of the fat from what would otherwise be a long, boring, all-day activity and give you a sequence of action-packed moments to be enjoyed in short play sessions with varying degrees of realism. The second is to embrace realism, but also go beyond merely simulating the mechanics of fishing and instead also replicate the vibe of what it's like to be a member of a fishing club, take part in events, and interact with other members on the same lake. The example that comes to mind here is Itoi Shigesato no Bass Tsuri No. 1 for the Super Famicom. As a lifelong Gran Turismo fan, there's nothing I love more than when a video game exudes head-to-toe respect and admiration for the culture of whichever sport or hobby it's ostensibly simulating. Despite being constrained by 16-bit hardware, Itoi Shigesato no Bass Tsuri No. 1 is single-handedly the most immersive fishing game I have ever seen, fully capturing the ambience of going fishing and being surrounded by beautiful nature. It's clear to me that this is the path that Fishing Freak's Bass Rise wanted to take on the PlayStation, but it stumbled its execution, and the WonderSwan version fares even worse. Comparing this game to Umizuri ni Iko immediately exposes how important presentation is in making a fishing game compelling to play. Looking back on it now, I didn't know how good I had it at the time I was making that video. As you've no doubt surmised from the footage you've been watching, once you've loaded into a map in Fishing Freak's Bass Rise, all gameplay happens from a top-down camera angle. Umizuri ni Iko instead opts to switch the camera angle and location based on what's actively happening. While casting, the camera is located behind the player character, so you can see not only yourself but also the lovingly rendered scenery you're fishing around. While your lure is underwater, it switches over to a cross-section of the body of water so you can get a feel for how deep it went and what's going on around it. When you catch a fish, they show you a close-up of the fish you caught that fills the full width of the landscape WonderSwan display, and these are the best sprites in the entire game. The top-down camera angle in Basterize really limits the amount of detail you will ever get to see. You don't really get to enjoy nature in the horizon because there is no horizon. You only get to enjoy whatever happens to be on the surface of the body of water, and unfortunately none of that ever really looks great. There's never any convincing feeling of depth to the body of water either, and the camera is so distant from the surface that fish sprites are only ever silhouettes with no distinguishing features. While you do see your player character holding the fish you caught after you catch it, it's nowhere as impressive as Umizuri ni Yuko's close-ups. It's also really strange to me that a game so obsessed with lures doesn't even really try to show them to you underwater. Don't forget that the PlayStation version featured licensed Megabass lures, and while the license did not carry over to the WonderSwan version, it still has tackle box management features and a full lure manual that teaches you about the effectiveness of various lures, lure colors, and bait rigs before you head out to the lake. The PlayStation version of the game is at least flawed in interesting ways, and it has quirks you can appreciate despite everything else that went wrong. The WonderSwan version probably should have just been sent back to the drawing board or scrapped altogether. As hard as I try to find anything kind to say about it, I keep coming back empty-handed.